Hey everybody, this is James Lindsay and you are listening to the new Discourses Podcast, and we're going back into yet another episode of the Nazi Experiment series. I believe this is episode 16 or something like this. We're getting up there to where I don't remember which number they are for sure. My notes say 16. Let's trust it. Okay, so this is a different episode. Let's just go ahead and say the thing. I mean, you've seen the title card if you're listening, so let's just pull the punch. This is a episode about what Hitler got right. And so this actually is me reading from another chapter of Mein Kampf, and I'm going to discuss the thing that I think Hitler actually got. I mean, he's a little bit biased, obviously. He's Hitler. He's a little bit biased. He's a little bit polemical. We'll call it polemical. But what he's doing, what he gets right is his criticism of parliaments, and I think this is going to be really important. Just to lay out why, and then we'll kind of jump into this. I've got to kind of also review what this series is about, if this is your first episode of it, which has a controversial title, so maybe it is. But long and short is that there's the parliaments are actually in some way a very weak form of government, and Hitler noticed this, and that they have very intrinsic problems that I think are pretty deep. And he has a pretty scathing, like I said, very polemical criticism of parliaments. But there's also some deep ironies here. For example, by exploiting parliamentary circumstances is basically the only way Hitler was able to take power and become a dictator. Hitler never got a majority of votes. There are rumors out there and claims out there that are ridiculous. A lot of course, what we do here in the Nazi Experiment Podcast is bust myths of ridiculous things that our young men are being fed by idiot podcasters and propagandists. It is not true that Hitler got 90% of the vote. Hitler got a very small percentage of the vote, which ended up getting him into the German parliament, which in fact ended up getting him into the position of chancellor of the parliament. And then what happened was about that was in January 33, end of February 33, I think, so roughly a month later, you have the Reichstag fire. So somebody sets fire to the German parliament building, to the Reichstag, and it is blamed on, possibly correctly, the story's a little murky, it gets blamed on a communist, and this ignites an anti-communist furor in F-U-R-O-R, not Führer like Hitler. This furor, this fervor. Let's just throw a V in there and just change it. This ignites an anti-communist fervor, and Hitler is able to ride this anti-communist fervor into passing an act in the German law that effectively turned, first of all, it allowed them to win more seats very quickly in the parliament. The Nazi Party, being strongly anti-Marxist in its branding, was able to win a large number more seats. This gave them just short of 50% in the parliament, in the Reichstag, because this election is right afterwards. And then on the backside of this, they use this numerical advantage in the Reichstag to basically give massive security powers or decision powers to the chancellor, who is Hitler. Hitler then uses these powers to establish himself as a dictator. So he never won. Everybody's like, well, the Nazis came in by election through democracy. Well, kinda. It's like there's a very big sort of here, right? Like they had a minority representation in the Reichstag, and then Hitler ends up getting in a very important role within this situation, and then they capitalize upon something to, in a moment of madness, win more representation in, but not even majority, close to majority, like 40 to 45% of the Reichstag seats, and then they use that with a little bit of help from their friends to establish emergency powers for Hitler, which he then immediately abuses to set himself up as Führer and absolute dictator. Now, there's an irony here. I know I'm getting into the weeds without really explaining it. I'm just doing it. There's an irony here because a lot of the political philosophy that allegedly justified the Nazi regime, or that did justify the Nazi regime, comes from Carl Schmitt, which is very popular with the woke right. Carl Schmitt was recognized as informally as the crown jurist of the Third Reich. He was an important philosopher in the Nazi regime from 1930 1933 till 1936, at which point he made somebody mad, and he is lucky to have escaped with his life. But he did, and he therefore also avoided any serious penalties come the Nuremberg trials later, but he never recanted of his Nazism. Very curious guy, but he had a whole book on dictatorship, of political philosophy, and his book on dictatorship says, well, you got two kinds of dictators. You got a commissarial dictator who takes emergency powers outside of the Constitution in order to restore the Constitution. He doesn't call it the Constitution; he calls it the normative order. So this is a commissarial dictator who is able to use dictatorial powers temporarily outside of the existing order to reestablish the normative system and to make it work. And then you have what he calls sovereign dictators, who basically just are what you think of as a dictator. They claim power, they claim their power is absolute, nobody can challenge them, because basically it's a further emergency that they use to claim more power if anybody challenges their power. And the second Hitler became an allegedly commissarial dictator in order to deal with this emergency of communist terrorism in Berlin. He turned himself into a sovereign dictator. It's like the people that support Carl Schmitt, the first thing that happened that could have been it confirms that Carl Schmitt's full of shit. And then immediately Carl Schmitt gets pulled into this orbit and then uses his own political philosophy to justify what Hitler's doing. What a freaking sellout, or lunatic, or both. But anyway, it turns out that I've done a couple episodes on Schmitt here in the series for that reason, and it's worth checking those out. Now, back to regular scheduling. So anyway, it was the parliamentary system being weak enough, ironically enough, that allowed Hitler to become the dictator that abolished the parliament in its meaningful sense. And his rant about the weakness of parliaments takes on this kind of ironic character to it. But since this is a really controversial thing to do, maybe I should have said this even sooner than 8 minutes in, that I'm saying what Hitler got right, I want to kind of lay out my purposes with this episode. So effectively, Hitler's criticizing parliaments. We have a lot of countries right now that have parliaments, have problems. How's the UK doing? How is Canada doing? Right? And then you look at New Zealand as a unicameral parliament. It doesn't even have two houses. It has one. They decided back in the 19th century that they didn't need both, so they got rid of one. New Zealand, Australia has a parliament. And these are non-presidential. France has a president in addition to a parliament. But then you have the EU, which is just a parliament. And in fact, a remarkably unwieldy one with over 900 members. If you didn't know that's how many how many MEPs there are, there's a lot. Okay, so, we look at these other European countries, we look at a lot of countries in the world parliaments, and we see problems. And this critique is going to ring true. And so there's kind of the point that I wanted to make, now that I'm another minute down the road, is that as I read this part of Mein Kampf, which comes from the 3rd chapter of the 1st volume, I was struck by how freaking happy I am to be an American. Because, okay, let's say that Hitler's critique of parliaments is right. It's polemical, it's over the top, it's biased, it's selective, it does not take into account where they have worked. For example, the British Parliament has actually done better than given credit for. Hitler actually says that he admires it, and had it only been the British and the German parliaments that he was looking at, that he would not have figured out how bad parliaments are. It took looking at the Austrian parliament for him to understand this. So it's biased. It's a polemical treatment. But let's say that it's mostly right, because I think it is actually mostly right. I double checked with 2 different of the AI, and it also said it's mostly right, but over the top, which was my assessment. Also, what we are confronted with is, let's say that that's correct, that parliaments are intrinsically problematic, weak, etc., exploitable to get a dictator even, it turns out. Well, you kind of have at least 2 choices for what you're going to do about it. Hitler said there was one choice, which is that you have to restore political decisionism, as it's called. That's Carl Schmitt's program. You have to have a leader, a Führerprinzip, the leader principle that takes over, and you have to have a highly rigid hierarchical accountability structure topped by a dictator. And that didn't work at all. That created one of the worst things that's ever happened. And the World War II and the Holocaust, among other, huge messes. And so that's, it turns out, not the only option. The American founders, as I was blessed and happy to be considering as I read this, had a different vision. Yeah, you do need a chief executive who has some decisionism. You do need a legislature that's structured like a parliament, ideally with two houses. So we get the Senate and the House of Representatives that are elected differently, with different parameters to their tenures, to different... we have lots of representatives, and we have two senators. The representatives are proportional to the population of each state, I should say, and we have two senators for each state, whether big or small. So California and Wyoming both get two senators, which some people don't like, and they built this in on purpose. And then you have a third co-equal branch of government, the judiciary, which is meant to deal with judicial matters, but in particular checking the legislative and executive branches to make sure that they are remaining within the boundaries of the Constitution. And all three of these three branches of our government have checks and balances on each other. So you have decisionism in the executive, but it's checked and balanced by the other two. I have a friend, his name was Bob McEwen, the Honorable Bob McEwen, former congressman from Ohio, was a big deal in the anti-communist stuff in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, a very big deal. Really an interesting man. And he and I were having a conversation not too terribly long ago, and the wonderful and great Bob McEwen was explaining that after all these years in politics, and of course, if he was a congressman back in the late 80s, you can put together that he's been around a few minutes. In all of these years of politics, he's starting to realize something that I think we should all think about, which is that legislative skill and executive skill are two different skill sets. So you have some people who are really good legislators, and they really get that, and they're really good at it, and really glad that we have them. Then you have some people who are good executives, and they might not be very good at policy or even like ideological coherence or whatever, but they know how to make a decision in a moment. They know how to lead, etc. It's very clear that he's got to be reflecting on the fact of President Trump not being great on the legislative side, but being very good on the executive side as part of the story. But this is very interesting because in the parliamentary system, your chief executive, especially if it's just a parliamentary system, in Britain they have obviously the monarchy, which whatever that is, and then you have these kind of presidential systems. You'll have other constitutional monarchies where they have a parliament and a king. But at any rate, when you have a purely parliamentary system like you do in Canada, for example, your chief executive is a legislator. And if those are two different skill sets, you can understand how there's a problem. And your chief executive as prime minister is actually a member of parliament, so therefore has to play all the stupid reindeer games of the parliament. We actually saw that where by running for prime minister in a very credible case, Pierre Poilievre in Canada, temporarily, as it turns out, lost his riding, lost his seat in the parliament. And so that was like, he's got to play two games if he's going to be prime minister. And then the legislature itself has most of the power over what, like in these parliamentary systems, the prime minister can be overturned every few weeks, or even faster, I suppose, if the legislature decides they don't like who they're putting in very, very quickly. Whereas in the U.S., there is an impeachment process. It's extraordinarily hard. The removal from office is even more difficult. And otherwise, the president serves for 4 years because he was elected by the people to be the executive for 4 years. It's a different system, so I'm very grateful to this. Okay, so this, now we're going to turn to the text in a moment. Just to remind you, this Nazi Experiment podcast series is meant to answer a question. What we're trying to do is address the fact that there were problems in Germany. A lot of our young people are facing very similar in some ways problems now. Societal humiliation of the people in their own generation, especially if they're young white male Christian conservatives or their female counterparts that believe in those kinds of things, don't have the issues of the left, the intersectional hierarchy of the left, and massive disruption from COVID, lots of things, very traumatic circumstance, a very destabilizing circumstance. And so the Nazis came along in the 1920s, going into the 1930s, with a set of solutions for the destabilizing situations of Germany. They had just been shattered in World War I. They got blamed for World War I. They had heavy sanctions put on them. They were the shame of Europe. And this proud people becomes a humiliated people. They're a broke people. The financial circumstance was terrible, rampant overinflation, massive poverty, massive debt. The United States steps in with loans, starts to stabilize the German economy, which kind of helps in the mid-1920s, and then the Great Depression hits, and the Germans go bankrupt again in 1929, and it's a catastrophic problem. Like, it's not a good situation. Hitler comes along promising that he's basically going to make Germany great again, so there's going to be this massive nationalist push. He's going to create a new system. It's going to be a socialism, but only for the German nationals, a national socialism. He's going to get Germans back to work. It's going to be a massive state intervention program to do so. People are going to have jobs. The economy is going to be roaring. He doesn't tell anybody that his program is actually going to be to build eventually, very quickly, certainly by 1937, a massive war economy, so that he can wage a war of conquest to the east, at least, to gain more living room, as Lebensraum, as he called it, in Europe for the Germans. And at any rate, this attempted solution, the Nazi experiment, was tried to solve those problems Germany faced, and it failed catastrophically, about as badly as it could. A world war, 100+ million dead across the war, and the Holocaust, the intentional, deliberate, attempted extermination of all Jews, both in Europe and ideally for them around the world, successfully murdering 6 million innocent Jews at the least, in a systematic campaign of destruction. And so that doesn't work. And so the message of this podcast is, look, we have problems. I understand there's a lot of frustration. We're also being heavily propagandized to believe that similar solutions to the Nazi experiment would work for the American experiment. And I want to reiterate, and this podcast is a great one to do that the American experiment is unique and different and is a better solution to similar and the same problems. And we can step in first or in this case, by looking at the nature of parliaments and Hitler's critique of parliaments, and why, as it turns out, the American system is actually better as a solution than the dictator system that Hitler offers. So we're going to go ahead and turn to the text. This is chapter 3 of volume 1 of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. This is going to be kind of a longer read because there's a lot in this chapter. This chapter is very long. I'm not reading nearly all of it, but it's very long. Before I get into the whole critique of the parliament, though, I want to read the first chapter of this the first paragraph, of this chapter, because I think it's amusing given what we're dealing with right now. And so we have a lot of very rambunctious, right-wing young guys who are getting kind of pulled into this proto-fascist or neo-fascist or even pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi kind of mentality, lots of authoritarianism. And so what did Hitler have to say about young people in politics? He starts this chapter this way. Generally, so if Hitler is if you're one of the people who are kind of that mind and you happen to be listening to this out of curiosity, here's what Hitler thought about you, young person who's involved in politics. Generally, a man should not be active in public politics under the age of 30, unless he is of extraordinary talent. P.S. That means not you. Charlie Kirk, yes. You, probably not. The reason is obviously that before that age, he has been building a general platform from which he can examine the various political problems and build his own beliefs. Only after he has established a fundamental world concept and has stabilized his own way of looking at the individual questions of the day should the man who has at least achieved an inner maturity be allowed to guide the community politically. So, if you like this guy, I don't recommend that you do, but if you do like this guy, I'll just point out that he's not a big fan of young people being in leadership in politics. And I think that's funny. It's just funny. It's there. I just wanted to share that. It's not my point. But we are talking about what Hitler got right, aren't we? Okay, so now what's the context of what we're about to get into? Because I'm going to actually skip a lot of the rambling context parts. So Hitler in this chapter is recounting his time in Vienna. He had that time just before he turned 20 years old. So he's a young man in Vienna. He is looking around. He turns 20 in 1909, so because he was born in 1889, and he is in Vienna from roughly 1908 to 1913. While he's there, he starts becoming politically awake. As a 19-year-old man, till his early 20s, he starts becoming politically awake, and he starts to observe not just Viennese culture, but Viennese politics. He starts going to the Austrian parliament and watching. Now, one of the factions in the parliament that's actually a minority faction, of course, Hitler doesn't like that, and that is still a very important faction, is the pro-German, or actually the pan-German faction. And the country is simultaneously, it's a constitutional monarchy, so it's got a parliament that does all the legislative stuff, but it's got a king, and the king is in fact one of the Habsburgs. So you have the Habsburg monarchy in place, and the Habsburgs are not, historically famous for being great by the early 20th century. Hitler really doesn't like them, but Hitler goes and observes the politics in the parliament and has a huge problem. Now, part of the reason for that, and this is kind of one last contextual point before we start jumping in and reading what he has to say, is that the Austrian and Austro-Hungarian Empire that he's in when he's in Vienna was multi-ethnic, very multi-ethnic. Okay, so you have Slavs, you have Czech, you have Germans, you have Austrians, you have Hungarians, I think there were Italians, you have all kinds of people there, and it's multi-ethnic. It was so multi-ethnic that in 1913, Vladimir Lenin sent Joseph Stalin to Vienna to observe this multi-ethnic situation in preparation to build a multi-ethnic Soviet Union. And so Stalin writes as kind of one piece of theory out of this experience in Vienna in 1913, so roughly around the same time Hitler's there. And that thing he wrote was called Nationalism and the Social... No, I always get this messed up. Something like Nationalism and the Socialist Question or something. No, Socialism and the Nationalist Question. Duh, that's what it is. So Stalin's trying to work out how nationalism is going to work as a key component of the various programs within Soviet Union. This is where the infamous Korenizatsiya program comes from, this idea that we go on to call DEI, that you're going to have ethnic self-determination so long as they're socialist. We're going to be nationalist in form as Stalin had it, but socialist in content, which, of course, Lenin rolls into his Raznoobrazia program, which is diversity, which is that you're going to be diverse in form with unity in content. The unity, of course, is socialism, and we're not going to get into the details. I did some whole podcasts about this, but at any rate, Hitler is observing this same multi-ethnic situation as Stalin at the same time in the lead up to World War I, which starts in 1914. So Hitler leaves in 1913. Stalin leaves and writes Marxism and the National Question. That's what it's called. I knew there was something. Marxism and the National Question in 1913. Finally got the title right. Okay, so that's the kind of context. You have a big multi-ethnic constitutional monarchy. The Habsburgs, who are hapless in Hitler's and most other people's view, are in charge. World War I is looming, so weird alliances and tensions are happening everywhere. Austria and Vienna are at the heart of that situation, and within the multi-ethnic coalitions within the parliament, you have a pro-German, or actually a pan-German faction that is being increasingly persecuted and sidelined by the Viennese, or by the Austrians, by the Habsburgs too. And Hitler's very much of the mind, as I think we'll hear, that if the Germans were allowed to continue to run Austria would have been a great success, but because of the situation, it's a miracle that they weren't all murdered or run out of the place. Okay, so that's the context for the situation. Let's jump into the text in a meaningful sense, starting a couple pages down from the beginning. Judging by its extent, Hitler writes, general political thinking in the old Danube monarchy, which is the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, So general political thinking in the old Danube monarchy was larger and more inclusive than in the old Germany of that period. So there's your ethnic diversity thing, except in parts of Prussia, Hamburg, and the coast of the North Sea. The Austrian part of the great Habsburg Empire was settled by Germans and was in every respect the cause of that state's creation. So they owe everything to the Germans. The population alone had the strength to support cultural life for centuries, yet was still politically artificial. The more time passed, the more the existence and future of that state came to depend on the preservation of this German seed of the empire. So Hitler's basic argument about what his observations are in Vienna is that Germans basically are the core, the heart, the seed that made the Austrian Empire work, and it's also the case that they depend on it, and that it's this multi-ethnic conglomeration that isn't depending on them and in fact is cornering them out. Now you can imagine what Hitler thinks because of Hitler's racialist world concept that he's developed by the age of 30 or whatever. He's solidified his world concept, and his world concept is in fact that the German race is a superior race and everything creative is downstream from the values and character of the Germans, which are racial. And so when you get a multi-ethnic society or you get miscegenation, the mixture of races, you degrade a society. When you share values and ideas across societies, you degrade the society and open the door for the blood mixing. This is the basic idea of the myth of the blood that we've been exploring in another series. And so a page or so later, he goes on to say the fact that the collection of races called Austria, and Austria is in scare quotes. So that's how he's looking at the situation. Austria is not its own country. It's a collection of races. Hitler doesn't like collections of races. He likes one race. One race, and he does prefer the German race, but one race being pure to him is superior to races mixing. So mixing of races is very bad. So the fact, he says, that the collection of the races called Austria went to its doom in no way discredits the political ability of Germans in the old Eastern territories. That was the impossible and inevitable result of trying to maintain a state with 50 million people of various nationalities for any length of time without definite principles being established. Okay, so the reason I wanted to cover this is, first of all, to reintroduce Hitler's idea of the racialist concept of the success of a folk and thus of a nation, which is the political extension of that folk. And to remind you that the racialist worldview and myth of the blood are at the core of what he's actually pushing, but it's also because we're now stepping into parallel territory for today. One of the arguments we hear from the for the radical right is that you cannot have a successful mixed race society like the United States of America without a dictator. R.N. McIntyre, not his real name, affiliated with the Blaze, has made this argument repeatedly. It's not that dictators are necessarily good or bad, it's that a mixed folk cannot survive, as Hitler puts it, for any length of time without definite principles being established, by which he means an authoritarian government to keep them in line. So this idea that the reason America is struggling, the reason we have all these problems, this idea that these problems are sourced from the fact that we're a multi-ethnic society and that multi-ethnic societies cannot possibly congeal without authoritarian force is resurging today. So we're not far from what I'm reading. That's kind of a lot of the point. And we're hearing, I haven't read very much of Hitler in this episode yet, but you get that same sense, and this argument's being made. And you say, wait, James, but they have a point, right? Like, what about these Somali fraudsters? What about the Muslim jihadis? What about, urban blacks who, side with BLM? What about the communists or whatever? What about? And the question is, how do you actually deal with a multi-ethnic society? And the question is, do you actually have to solve this with political power and political force, or is it in fact possible to create a cohering culture across ethnic divisions? And I think that the latter is true. I think that if we actually adopt a superordinate identity, we see ourselves as Americans, we do expect in certain ways assimilation by populations, and we do something when to encourage that, but also to deal with the problems that arise when it doesn't happen, in ways that are threatening to individual rights. For example, Sharia law is an example that's a threat to anybody's individual rights who is affected by it, that we actually can create a coherent society. But it also does require that we adopt a saner immigration policy, which is that we don't really allow immigration from people who don't want to assimilate. Like, we really do need a sane immigration policy that says that if you don't want to be American, I know it's great here, but you don't need to be American. Like, it should actually, in my opinion, be a prerequisite that you want to actually be American and show real signs of that, and that you're a likely benefit to America. We should be talent scalping, in my opinion, not just like letting anyone come in. If we're going to have the kind of a state that we have. If we want to do, we can do the full Milton Friedman argument here. If we want to have much more open immigration, that's okay, but we can't have anything like a welfare state. Milton Friedman was completely right about that. You can't mix wide open immigration and a welfare state, because the way that you basically get what we might call bad immigrants in line is you make them have to work, and you make them have to fit in order to be able to work, and it kind of buck breaks them on their defiance. And if they don't like it, they can leave. So I agree with Milton Friedman, and I think most of the woke right actually would probably agree with this point as well, that we're trying to do two impossible things at the same time. It's just that, in my opinion, their solution is the wrong one. Their solution tends toward wanting to create an authoritarian system that basically decides it's going to, crack down on people for having the wrong values and kicking people out for having the wrong values rather than for doing the wrong things. Anyway, turning back to Hitler, he's going to go on now for several pages to talk quite a lot about how the German-Austrian circumstance is, in fact, not only what founded the Austrian Empire, but what sustained it on virtually every level. So what you heard was a snippet that, it owes this credit to the seed of the German. No. And he says, it's what sustains it. No, he goes on for like well over a page about how the German element within the Austrian circumstance, the German Austrian as a character, basically it is the only reason that Austria is working at all. So all these other races, the Slavs and so on, are just dead weight or worse. And meanwhile, he goes on to talk about that this is the case, that they owe everything to the Germans that are there, and yet they're being squeezed and pressed and persecuted and dwindling in numbers. Again, this is all, like I said, the pre-World War I circumstance. And he compares the German Empire under Bismarck, which was mostly one race and therefore strong and focused around the essential element, which is maintaining the race and the folk, to the Austrian situation and Austro-Hungarian situation by saying that Austro-Hungarian Empire lacks this foundation. The reverse is actually true. The German side, you have one race and it's a strong empire under Bismarck, and on Austro-Hungary, it is the reverse. There are lots of racial elements and it's weak, therefore it goes to its doom. His point that he makes is that whether or not the leadership was thinking clearly about the issue or the issues at hand and the relevance of the German element, they sometimes realized it, they sometimes didn't, but they still lacked the essential necessary core of a continuous race, or actually a dictator that could whip them into unified shape in order to make their system work. Therefore, their system didn't work, and the cause, or the result, I should say, of that set of causes is the set of triggers that spiraled into World War I, because the Austro-Hungarian alliance it was a triple alliance with the Czech and with it was with the Germans and with the Ottomans, is what ultimately drags all of this mess into World War I, because there's another triple alliance going on between Britain and France and somebody else, Russia, I think. And this spirals out of control for reasons nobody fully understands in 1914. After, was it Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated in Prague or something like this. I'm not a historian, I'm a mathematician, I'm doing my best here. All right, guys, I got to tell you about a big, exciting event coming up from New Discourses. This is our New Discourses Preserving Liberty Conference at Sea, November 15 through 22nd, 2026, sailing round trip out of Tampa, Florida. You won't want to miss it. Cabins are limited, so head over to ndcruise.com and reserve your spot today. That's ndcruise.com. Okay, so skipping down another couple pages of that, Drac, Hitler picks up in Germany. He says it just to give you the taste of what he's actually saying. In Germany, it was only a question of overcoming political traditions, since a common cultural basis was always there. Germany was primarily made up of only one group of people, aside from small alien fragments, so it was mostly one folk. In Austria, he says the situation was reversed. Except for Hungary, the individual countries had no political memory of their own grandeur, and among the people that memory had been eliminated. Now nationality and racial forces began to develop again, which was increasingly difficult to overcome as national states began to form along the edges of the monarchy. So what he's saying is, look, you tried to mix a bunch of people, you didn't have a strong enough central authority to tame them into one people. Therefore, the national elements started to rise. The Germans within started to think of themselves not as Austro-Hungarian citizens, but as Germans, and the Slavs started to think of themselves as Slavs, the Czechs as Czechs, the Hungarians as Hungarians, and whatever else. And this just won't work. So except for Hungary, the individual countries had no political memory of their own grandeur, and among the people that memory had been eliminated, so they don't know who they are, they're deracinated, but nationality and racial forces began to develop again. This is very much, by the way, the Return of the Strong Gods argument that R.R. Reno makes in his book, The Return of the Strong Gods, that if you try to suppress the racial and national elements, they will come back roaring in some perverted dark form because they are essential to what it means to be people. Hitler thinks they're located in the blood. I'm not going to guess where R.R. Reno thinks they're located, but that they are essential tribal identity factors of being human. So the nationality and racial forces began to develop again, Hitler says, which was increasingly difficult to overcome as national states began to form along the edges of the monarchy. The people of these states, racially related or similar to the individual fragments within Austria, now began to exert a stronger attraction than the German-Austrian could. Even Vienna, remember, the German-Austrian is the character who's holding the whole thing together, and now what's happening is the races are splintering away, and they're not listening to the German-Austrian anymore. Even Vienna, he says, could not hold out for long in this conflict. Skipping a little through this, the local national instincts acquired a spiritual foundation and gained a more profound hold on the people. So this thing gets fragmented. People start to see themselves spiritually or at the level of their identities in a very core way as national outside of the German-Austrian Empire. And this is going to cause deep fragmentation, which again leads to their defeat. The time, he says, was sure to come when the interests of each country would become stronger than their common imperial interest. So the Habsburgs are not successfully holding this empire together. Once that stage had been reached, he said, Austria's doom was sealed and the empire would fall apart. And that doom, it turns out, arrives historically, I just said I'm not a historian, with the end of World War I, which destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, separated them from the Ottoman Empire, obliterated the Ottoman Empire, shrunk it down to the modern state of Turkey, created the British and French mandatory regions in Palestine and Syria, blah, 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 and set up basically the entire structure of the last century and the entire world system that we are dealing with today. So Hitler goes on to explain a little bit more, both administration and political leadership, in order to deal with that imperial kind of situation with mixed peoples. Both administration and political leadership must be conducted with rigid unity. I learned a lot. So that's his answer. It's not a federalist system like the United States. It's not freedom where we bind together around a common interest and whatever else. maybe a common American culture of believing in that common interest and the blessings of liberty and so on. No, administration and political leadership must be conducted with rigid unity. So that you're going to have this rigidity enforced from the top if you want a multi-ethnic empire, which is exactly the argument people like Aaron McIntyre, not his real name, are making about America and why it's not succeeding at the level they think it should be. So he's rehashing this same argument. That's my point. This is why we do the Nazi experiment thing, because the same arguments are now seducing our young people today. So he says, I learned a lot when I discovered why this was not done and why this did not happen. The person guilty of this omission was the one who was completely responsible for the collapse of the empire. He goes on, skipping a little, it is the House of Habsburg's fault that this was not understood. Fate gave one of them the opportunity to change the future of his country, but that flame of hope was extinguished forever. A little further down, he explains, more than any other state, old Austria depended on the greatness of its leadership. The cornerstone of a national state was missing, however. That's race, by the way. The basis of a national state is the people, he says, and they still have the power to sustain it no matter how bad the leadership is. However, this is not true of an empire composed of different people who are living under a common strong arm of leadership and not connected by common blood. So he's like, this isn't going to work if you have a multi-ethnic society. In this situation, he says, governing weakness does not lead to the hibernation of the state, but to an awakening of all the individual instincts which are present in the blood of the various groups. So I recall you to the myth of the blood, which says that values, character, ideology, everything are actually consequences of the blood. The race makes the man. The idea, the values, the character are genetic. They are part of what's in the blood. And he says those individual instincts are going to awaken in the blood of the various groups. Even if they are unable to grow under the influence of a single dominant will, the individual elements will still rise. Only centuries of common education, common tradition, and common interest can reduce that danger. Again, the woke right's making the same argument about the United States, saying that we're in the same danger because of our multi-ethnicity, and that we haven't had centuries of forceful common education, common tradition, common interest. And in fact, through all the immigration that we've done in the recent years, which is substantial, sizable, concerning, that we've watered ourselves down too much too quickly. Hitler says, this is why the younger a state structure is, ding America, this is why the younger a state structure is, the more they depend on the greatness of their leadership. In fact, the work of strong, outstanding figures and intellectual heroes often collapses immediately after the death of the great, lonely founder. You often will hear this, that once the founding generation died out, America had already fundamentally changed. Again, this woke right is making the same kinds of arguments to seduce our young people. Even after centuries, Hitler says, however, these dangers cannot be considered defeated. They are sleeping because the blood is intrinsic, and the values are an extension of the blood, and the character is an extension of the blood, and the ideas are an extension of the blood. So even after centuries, these dangers cannot be considered defeated. They are sleeping and will often suddenly awake the moment weakness in common leadership is felt. The force of education and the grandeur of tradition are no longer strong enough to overcome the native life force in the various races. Now, the quick side point here is, this means that Hitler understands that for the German Empire that he wants to build, the Third Reich, to be successful, it must be purified of race. Almost everything horrible that happens, like the Holocaust and a lot of his dictatorship citizenship policies, follow from that. The repurification of the race is actually a necessity. The woke right does not boldly say this in most corners. They do in some corners. They say vague things like the white race. Nobody's quite sure who the white race is or which ethnicity it represents. There are a lot of white peoples in the world, but they are somewhat vague about that. They also talk about the heritage American and so on. They're not quite as racially motivated as Hitler. These guys are actually a little bit more Duginistic. Dugin says that the relevant thing is the land, it's not the blood. Hitler went too into the racial thing. And these guys are more like it's having a stake in this country that goes back generations. it's a heritage thing. It's a little bit different, a little bit different, a little bit different, but it's the same general structure of argument that people, you can never, ever, ever, ever take the essential core out of somebody as they actually are, because there's some kind of, in this case, genetic force that makes them who they are. So a little further down, we're going to skip. We're actually going to start reading. Let me grab the text at the right page. I have to change pages. So watching the empire dissolve, Hitler says, was as moving as it was instructive. So he's now watched. He knows that the empire is dissolving. World War I hasn't hit here, but he's also writing this after World War I, so he knows what's going to happen. So he's watching this dissolve as described. He's blaming the racial mixing and the lack of properly strong leadership, and now he's going to take some lessons from that. Watching the empire dissolve, he says, was as moving as it was instructive. The execution of a historical sentence took place in 1,000 different ways. So history was removing, Hitler's saying that history was removing the Austrian Empire from the story. This was a historical force. It's an insurmountable force. He says the fact that most people, why? Because the determining fact of a people in history is unity of the blood, and they didn't have it. So the execution of a historical sentence, they deserve the judgment of having their empire destroyed because they mixed the blood, took place in 1,000 different ways. The fact that most people walked blindly through the resulting decay only proved that it was God's will to destroy Austria. Again, because they mixed their races and stopped listening to the Germans. I do not want to get lost in the details. That is not my purpose. I only want to provide information about those processes which still have importance for us today and which helped to establish my political way of thinking, like the unchanging causes of the decay in the people and the state. The institutions that most clearly demonstrated the decay inside the Austrian monarchy was the parliament, or Reichsrat, as it was called in Austria, which should have been the strongest institution. This was obvious even to the half-blind, privileged class Philistine. So now he's going to lay not most of the blame on the Habsburgs, but the institutional failure of their own mixed, very important, again, mixed ethnicity parliament. Now, he is a little happy here about where it came from because he's more positive about the British Parliament, at least for the moment. He says, the model for this group was obviously in England, the land of classical democracy. And democracy's in scare quotes. He's not a big fan of this. This is an anti-democratic solution. He's going to impugn democracy. He says that excellent parliamentary structure was transferred almost directly to Austria with as little alteration as possible. In the House of Deputies and the House of Lords, the English two chambers of government were resurrected. This has repeated itself all over the world, by the way. Only the houses themselves were somewhat different. When Barry built his palaces, or as we say, the Houses of Parliament on the shore of the Thames, he could take the inspiration for his work from the history of the British Empire. In that history, he found sufficient material to fill and decorate the magnificent corridors. His statues and paintings made the House of Lords and the House of Commons temples dedicated to the glory of the nation. Here was Vienna's first problem. When Hansen, the Danish architect, he goes on, finished a new marble house of the people's representatives, there was nothing he could do but borrow from antiquity for decoration. So now he's saying that this whole thing is not going to work. It's all set to fail, but they're borrowing from the English. And the idea is that they were just kind of copying the English Parliament, which was the right model there, but they weren't going to be able to make it work. And the reason they're not going to be able to make it work is from one step after another, they've imported something foreign and it isn't successful to the English are not a mixed ethnicity program at the time, and they are. So we're going to skip down a little bit further. To before I was 20. Where does he say that? Before I was 20, he says, skipping a little bit of the details about the architecture of the parliamentary. Before I was 20, I had mixed feelings the first time I went into the splendid building. So now you know that they built it all nicely, but in a confused way. I went into the splendid building on the famous Ring Street to see and hear a sitting of the House of Deputies. I had always hated the Parliament. It wasn't the institution I hated, because as a lover of freedom, I could not imagine any other kind of government. So he didn't hate Parliament intrinsically. He said he had always hated the Parliament, but it wasn't the institution that he hated, because he loved freedom. So he just didn't have the necessary imagination. He couldn't be unburdened by what has been to see what could be, or whatever, right? He wasn't able to see what could be, unburdened by what has been, as Kamala Harris might have it. And as a result of my attitude toward the Austrian House of Habsburg and their ruler, the thought of any sort of similar dictatorship would have seemed a crime against liberty and reason. This is why I kind of wanted to introduce the context as much as I did, which was a lot more than I wanted to spend time on it. One of the main reasons for this, and remember the point here is that Hitler is about to criticize the living hell out of Parliament, and it's not only entertaining, but for all of its polemical nature, largely on the nose. And so we're talking about what he actually got right and then did something wrong with it. So the point here is that you can be right about something in the narrow sense, like the woke right is right about many of the injustices people have faced. In the narrow sense, a lot of our young people are right about the trauma of their childhood under woke and COVID and every other thing, the lying of all of our institutions. But it doesn't mean that you're right in the general sense about what to do with it. You don't actually have to have a racialist worldview or a heritage American worldview, or assert a dictatorship or a strong iron fist of power, or adopt a racialist identity, or blame everything on the Jews. It turns out none of those are necessary solutions to a set of problems that you rightly identify, or mostly rightly identify. Again, it's very polemical, and you already heard that it's all rooted on the myth of the blood, which is itself crackpot crazy pants. I recommend you go listen to those podcasts, especially if you're Catholic. They're not big fans of Catholics. So if you're Catholic and kind of radical right, like, you should hear how they thought of you. They blame literally the entire downfall of Europe on Catholicism. So like, maybe chill with your Euro slop. I don't know. Anyway, one of the main reasons for this fact, he says, that he didn't want the House of Habsburg as a ruler, blah, 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 Parliament. One of the main reasons for this fact was the fact that my constant newspaper reading as a young man had given me protection without me even realizing it. There was a certain admiration for the English Parliament, an admiration I could not get rid of very quickly. According to the great reports in our newspaper, the dignity with which even the lower house fulfilled its duties, that's the House of Commons, impressed me greatly. How could there possibly be any nobler form of self-government for a people, meaning than a parliament? Okay. For that very reason, I was an enemy of the Austrian parliament. Wait, what? The way the whole thing was carried on, he said, seemed to me unworthy of its great model. So the British Parliament has a great model. What a fantastic way to do government. But what are the Austrians doing? So he's going and observing the Austrian Parliament, and he's like, well, they're totally messing this up. As a lover of freedom, I can't stand to see this thing abused. That's his mentality. The following considerations, he says, also influenced my attitude. The fate of the German race in the Austrian state depended on its position in the Austrian parliament. Until the introduction of secret ballot voting for all men, there was still at least a small German majority in parliament, even if it was an insignificant one. Even this was dangerous. The national attitude of the Social Democrats was unreliable, and in crucial questions concerning German character, they always fought against German interests to avoid losing their followers among the various alien peoples. Even in those days, social democracy could not be considered a German party. Social democracy and Marxism are very tightly tied here, by the way. The introduction of universal voting, however, destroyed the German numerical superiority. There was no longer any obstacle to the further de-Germanization of the state. Remember, the whole state depends on the success of its German element. He says, the instinct of national self-preservation made it impossible for me to welcome a representative system where the German element was not represented properly. So he feels like my national element in this empire is not properly represented, so I cannot support this because I believe in national self-preservation. You're starting to hear logic that echoes today. But it was instead betrayed, he says, by the social democratic fraction. These defects could not be attributed to the parliamentary system as such, but rather to the Austrian state. I still believed that if the German majority could be restored in this representative body, there would be no need to oppose such a system as long as the old Austrian state continued to exist. So he's actually walking you through his red pilling right now about the parliament. Well, it's got some problems. It's not worthy of the model. It's got this secret ballot thing for everybody, and now it's de-Germanizing, and Germans are in a bad situation, and oh no. But it's still good. It's still good. He's red pilling. He's telling you his red. This is a narrative book, by the way. It's an autoethnography, and he is telling you his red pill story about parliaments. This, he said, was the opinion I held when I entered those sacred and coveted halls. For me, they were sacred only because of the radiant beauty of that majestic building, a Greek wonder on German soil. Soon, though, I was outraged at the wretched spectacle that happened right there before my eyes. There were several hundred representatives present who were expressing their opinions on a question of economic importance. The events of the first day alone gave me enough to keep me thinking for weeks. He's a very ranty guy, by the way, but this is his narrative about how he red pills about the parliament. The intellectual content of what they said was at an extremely depressing level, that is, if you could understand their chatter at all. If this gives you any sense of the British or the Australian or the Canadian Parliament right now, feel free to laugh. In fact, feel free to laugh quite a lot. Just don't get pulled in by the idea that a dictatorship's the solution. The American government has given you a much better one. Some of the gentlemen, he says, didn't speak German. They only sputtered in their Slavic mother tongues or dialects. Now I had the chance to hear with my own ears what I had previously known only from reading the papers. It was a wild commotion with gesturing, yelling, and interruptions in every tone of voice. In the middle of it all was a harmless old man who was trying his best to restore the dignity of the house by violently ringing a bell and shouting in a soothing way, then in warning tones. I could not help laughing. A few weeks later, I visited the chamber again. The scene was transformed beyond recognition. The hall was almost empty. Down below, people were asleep. A few deputies were in their seats, yawning at one another while one of them, quote, spoke. A vice president of the House was present, and he looked over the chamber with visible boredom. I will tell you that I have visited a number of parliamentary chambers myself and seen exactly that scene. Of course, that scene is visible in Congress and in many of the state houses in the U.S. states as well, which are our parliamentary island model. What am I looking for? Pocket. Our legislatures work like parliaments, but they are one branch out of three in the government. At first, he says, he doesn't say that. He says, I had my first misgivings. So now the institution itself is starting to crumble in his eyes. His red pilling. I had my first misgivings, but I kept looking on in meetings whenever I could possibly find time. I watched what was going on quietly and attentively, listened to as much of the speeches as was understandable, studied the more or less intelligent faces of the chosen representatives of the nations in this sad state, and then gradually formed my own ideas. Every time Hitler forms his own ideas, it's not that good, by the way. A year of calm observation was enough to absolutely change, or rather destroy, my former opinions on the nature of the institution. So after a year of watching this spectacle in the parliament, he doesn't just dislike the Austrian parliament, he dislikes parliament itself. I no longer objected to the distorted form parliament had assumed in Austria. No, now I could no longer acknowledge parliament as a government body at all. Up until now, I had only seen the ruin of the Austrian parliament in the lack of a German majority, but now I saw destruction in the whole nature and character of the institution. I saw a whole new series of questions that needed to be answered. So now we see the justification for why we're going to read his critique of Parliament as an institution itself, not this Parliament or that Parliament or the Parliament, but of Parliament as a government entity. So I watch some of my neighboring countries, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and so on, the EU with its unwieldy parliament. I watch some of these things and I think to myself, my goodness. And then I read what he has to say here and I'm like, my goodness. which is why I wanted to share this to you in this kind of uncouth way. He said, I began to familiarize myself with the democratic principles of majority rule as the foundation of the whole institution, but I was equally attentive to the intellectual and moral values of the gentlemen who were the chosen members of the nations and who were supposed to pursue this goal. I became familiar with both the institution and the men who made it up. So as you can imagine, he's now going to tell you there are two kinds of intrinsic problems with parliaments: the nature of the democratic institution itself, and the fact that the people that end up in it suck. That the representatives themselves, the members of parliaments, are garbage people. Those are going to be his two critiques. And you're kind of, if you're a Canadian, you're probably like, I feel this. Within a few years, he says, my perception and understanding allowed me to form a clear and well-rounded image of the most dignified figure of modern times. This is sarcasm, by the way. The parliamentarian, the most dignified figure of modern times. Now, Hitler's not a fan of modern times. The most dignified figure of modern times, the parliamentarian. He made an impression on me in a way which had never significantly changed. The object lessons of this first-hand experience had again preserved me from smothering in a theory which many people find so seductive at first glance, but which is actually a sign of decay in mankind. So he's now grateful that he's learned what a parliamentarian is. He's going to critique the people in parliaments. He's grateful that he learned what they're like, because otherwise he might have been sucked in to believe in parliamentary democracies, which he says are actually a sign of decay in mankind. So the shitty people red-pilled him first. The democracy of the West today, he says, is a forerunner of Marxism. That is the argument we hear from the woke right as well. But I'm going to just couch this in saying he's talking about European parliaments. He's not talking about American republic with three divided branches of government that are co-equal. So the democracy of the West today, he says, is a forerunner of Marxism, and without it, Marxism would be unthinkable. It alone gives this plague the surface on which to grow. So in the U.S., it's more of our bureaucratic apparatus and our nonprofit integration, which is its own set of problems. But he's saying the parliament itself is structurally organized in order to give Marxism the opportunity to grow in a country. Its outer form, the parliament style of government, is a, quote, monstrosity of filth and fire, but this creative fire seems to me burnt out at the moment. Now, there's a little note here from the editor. Hitler's humorous use of this quote is from Goethe's Faust, where Faust calls Mephistopheles, "You are the monstrosity of filth or crap and fire." He says, Hitler says, I am grateful to fate for approaching me with this question in Vienna. I am afraid that if I had been in the Germany of that time, it would have made the answer too easy. In my first encounter with the ridiculous institution called Parliament, if it had been in Berlin, I might have made the error of believing the opposite. With good reason, I may have joined those who saw the salvation of the people and empire solely in strengthening the power of the imperial structure, and remained a blind stranger to current times and to human nature. In Austria, it was impossible to make this mistake. If Parliament was worthless, the Habsburgs were worth even less. To oppose the idea of a Parliament was not enough, because the question of what now would still be there. The abolition of the Parliament would have only left the House of Habsburg as a governing power. This idea was especially unbearable to me. Now, notice he set up this little thing. Had I been in Germany, I never really kind of gone all the way, because if we would have got rid of the German parliament, if it was ridiculous, at least there would be this German imperial force, a Kaiser or something, to run things, and I would have thought, well, that's not that bad. However, in Austria, you had to fall back on the Habsburgs, who are hapless. He says, this particular case was so difficult, it made me, as a youth, take a closer look than I would have otherwise. So the situation of Austria being a mess, he's 20 years old or so, looking in, and this makes him think harder about the institution itself than he would have. What struck me first and gave me the most food for thought was the obvious lack of any individual responsibility. Now, here's our first real critique. And this is I'm going to just say it. It's scathing and it's correct. If you are in a country with a parliamentary system, or if you're an American looking at Congress as our microcosmic parliamentary apparatus for legislation, this is going to resonate. What struck me first and gave me the most food for thought was the obvious lack of any individual responsibility. No matter how disastrous the result, no one is responsible or accountable for the passage of a parliamentary resolution. Is all responsibility nullified when a parliament retires for the evening after making a catastrophic decision? Or perhaps responsibility is dissolved with the election of a new parliament or formation of a new coalition? Can any majority which is unable to make a decision ever be held responsible? Isn't the very idea of responsibility not firmly connected with people? You have to have a person to be responsible for something. Can anyone make the head of a government accountable if he acts based on the decision made by a crowd of people? Do you understand what he's just saying? Do you understand what this string of questions is? He's like, who's responsible for anything that happens? They vote. Something terrible comes out of the vote. Nobody in particular made that decision. There was a crowd that made the decision. And then they all go home and it's nobody's fault. So when we look at the American Congress has a pitiful approval rating, extraordinarily low. But if you look at the re-election of incumbents, you see most Americans send their congressmen back to Congress, even though they hate Congress. They think Congress is terrible and screwing everything up. But then they send their congressmen back to Congress, thus reconstituting mostly the same body. This is the kind of thing that he's talking about. So it must be the other people's fault that, Congress is doing terrible things. It's passing terrible omnibus bills or whatever. And if this is a parliament like in Canada, it's 1,000 times worse, okay? Or in Britain or whatever. Okay, so it's passing terrible bills, but it was not your guy necessarily who passed the terrible bill or whatever. So you don't have any accountability access to deal with the Congress or the Parliament. You can only deal with your particular representative. So can any majority which is unable to make a decision ever be held responsible? Isn't the very idea of responsibility not firmly connected with people? Can anyone make the head of a government accountable if he acts based on the decision made by a crowd of people? Instead of developing constructive ideas and plans, is the business of a statesman actually the art of making a flock of sheep understand his plan? Is it his job to explain and coach them on common sense so that they will grant him their generous approval, or is his job instead to improve the nation? Should a statesman possess a gift of persuasion greater than the statesman's ability to conceive great political measures and make them happen? Is a statesman incompetent if he fails to win over a majority of votes to support his policy in an assembly which has been called together as the chance result of an electoral system that is not always honestly administered? You're starting to hear the same kinds of questions. So did your congressman really fail? Let's say you have a great congressman. Did he really fail if he couldn't convince Ilhan Omar, which is that person even legitimately there to go along with it, and therefore the resolution failed? Has this parliamentary crowd ever understood any idea before it was a success? Isn't every accomplishment of genius in this world the result of the one genius going against the inertia of the masses? What is the statesman supposed to do if flattery fails to win the crowd's approval for his plans? Is he supposed to accept it? Is he supposed to abandon the tasks which he knows are vital to the people and go home or retire? Does he quit even if he knows failure resulted from the stupidity of his fellow citizens? Or is he to stay regardless? In a case like this, doesn't a man of real character fall into hopeless conflict between his insight and his honorable intentions? Where is the dividing line between duty to the community and duty to one's personal honor? Shouldn't every true leader refuse to be degraded by acting as a political juggler? On the other hand, shouldn't every juggler feel a call to go into politics, since the ultimate responsibility falls on some undefined mob and not him? Again, I'll take a breath to let you take in, like, you've probably stared at your parliament or at Congress and thought almost the same stuff. He goes on, there are more questions. This is one of the longest paragraphs in this book. a very ranty guy, long paragraphs. Must our parliamentary majority lead to the total destruction of the leader concept? And here you have that seed. So the parliamentary majority concept is there's some crowd, it votes for things, some things pass, some things fail. Nobody's really responsible for anything good or bad that happens. Nobody really knows what's going on, and everybody has to kind of play in this game, and he's going to talk a lot about that. Or should we have a leader who has responsibility, whatever? And so the Führer principle, the leader concept that's right there, is now introduced as the answer. Notice again that my comparison here is that I was very proud to be an American reading this. I'm reading how crappy parliaments are, and I remember in America, we have Congress as one of our 3 co-equal branches of government. It's in 2 houses, and we have an executive who still functions according to something like a leader concept, except that he's not an absolute leader. He is a checked leader. Our founders were brilliant. He says, can anyone believe that this world comes from the brain of majorities and not from the heads of individuals? So remember, the Führer principle, the leader concept in the Nazi model, the decisionism and Carl Schmitt's philosophy that we've talked about in the past, all comes down to this idea that individuals make decisions, crowds or groups don't make decisions. Parliaments are crowds or groups. They're deciding by votes. Therefore, nobody's responsible for anything bad that happens, and nobody gets real credit for anything good that happens. So all of the incentives are all messed up, and the body itself is worthless, is his argument, as a governing body. Now, this is why in the U.S. system, it is not a governing body, it is a legislative body. It is not an executive body. But in pure parliamentary systems, it is the executive body as well. And then you're looking at Canada and Britain and Germany and thinking, oh my God, I kind of get it. I kind of get it. And the Germans at the time listening to Hitler were hearing this and thinking, yeah, the Weimar Parliament sucks. Why don't we have real leaders? We can't hold any of these assholes responsible? Why don't we put some people in we could hold responsible, and that'll make them do the right thing? And if they do the right thing and they do well, then we can reward them as we should. And they're thinking this makes a lot of sense. And all of a sudden, the Führer principle starts making a lot of sense to them in place of the parliamentary system. And again, I'm reading this thinking, my God, thank God that the founders of the United States of America understood that we needed an executive branch that's separate from the legislative branch, where each of them can counter each other or check each other, and that the legislative branch is the one that functions like a parliament, and the executive branch functions like a president who presides and executes, etc. How good is this? Because we're not having this question in the 1920s and 1930s, staring at the dysfunctions of our Congress, which have been from the beginning, by the way. Our Congress has always been a little bit dysfunctional. Like Sam Houston beat another congressman with a stick over a matter of honor and insult. He says, or does anyone believe that we can someday do without this essential aspect, meaning individual leadership of human civilization, the individual? Can we not say that today, more than ever before, the creative brain of the individual is indispensable? By rejecting personal authority and substituting the mass of the crowd, the parliamentary principle of majority rule sins against the basic aristocratic idea of nature. So now we have 2 ideas happening at the same time. This is how this often works. Number 1, you're like, yeah, this parliament thing's a little bit messed up. The founders in the United States said, let's put it in a box called one branch of government and let it not be the executive branch, right? On the other hand, what we have is Hitler saying it's a sin, it doesn't work. And what is it a sin against? Nature's basic aristocratic idea. Oh, you need an aristocratic system of leaders instead. You need an elite principle instead. Oh, that's a different model. So again, he can be complete. What he just said, if you have a parliament or you have Congress to look at, you just resonated with in almost all likelihood. It doesn't even matter if you're on left or the right, whichever party, Republican, Democrat in the U.S., liberal, conservative, NDP, God only knows what all the frickin' parties are in the UK. We'll say Labour and Tory, but there's like 47 other ones, Green, whatever, Reform, something, I don't know. That's parliamentary stuff. The American mind cannot comprehend a parliament because we have a better system. And so he's looking at this and you think, wow, he's so right about all of this. And then he's like, it's a sin against a basic principle of nature, which is a leader principle attached to or aristocracy, to an elite ruling group, the party. And oops, he just shuttled in a different idea. And the U.S. is a living I'm so happy again because the U.S. is a living refutation of the idea that you can be right in the narrow sense and wrong in the broad sense, and there might be a different solution where you can be right in the narrow sense and also right in a different way in the broader sense. He says, however, we must admit that nature's idea of nobility is not necessarily represented in the present decadence of our upper 10,000 government and community leaders. So he does not believe that their system's in line with nature. Remember, his idea of nature is that nature is a brutal competition, that the most powerful and bellicose rise to the top, and that's literally the point of the theory of evolution upon which his ideas are based, although he even gets Darwin wrong. I know a lot of my Christian listeners don't want me to rescue Darwin, but we can rescue Darwin from Hitler if we're being honest, because while he is using a Darwinian competition evolutionary eugenic model, he doesn't get Darwin's point correct. He's actually wrong about the way that it works and has created a pseudoscience based off of it. Okay. Hitler goes on. If he has learned to think independently, the reader of Jewish newspapers can hardly imagine the havoc brought on by the institution of modern democratic parliamentary rule. So look, if you listen to CNN or MSNBC, what he's calling the Jewish newspapers, if you listen to the mainstream media, as we've been calling it, the establishment press or whatever, or if you're listening to CBC in Canada or wherever else, BBC in Britain, then you can't even imagine the havoc brought on by parliament in your country. Because they don't give you the opportunity. They never tell you what the problems are. They just, our democracy, our democracy, our democracy. So he's, again, saying something resonant, that the media backs up the parliament, the ruling class structure. Now, of course, when you start talking about the ruling class structure versus all the people, you're starting to get into that Marxist oppressor versus oppressed system, and this is why they're woke. But he's got a point here that is true. That is, if you're listening to the, we'll call it establishment press, he calls it the Jewish newspapers, that you'll never actually even be able to imagine the havoc brought on by the institution of the modern democratic parliamentary rule. This rule is the main reason why our whole political life is so overrun with the inferior figures of today. We have crappy governance because we have a crappy government model, he says. A true leader is bound to withdraw from political activity that consists of largely trading favors and haggling for the approval of a majority rather than creative work and achievement. This kind of activity only attracts small minds, not great thinkers. So here he's saying that the system of parliament is rigged up only to attract the wrong kind of garbage people. You do not get massive, strong, powerful leaders attracted to a parliamentary system because it's all about trading favors and haggling, not about doing something great in terms of destiny. So you only attract small minds and not great thinkers, and this is a key criticism when he's making of parliaments, and you're probably thinking, like, you're looking at your parliament and thinking, yeah. The smaller the mind of this petty man who sees politics as a trade, the more clearly he recognizes his own misery, and the more loudly he will praise a system which does not demand great strength or genius. He is contented with the slyness which makes an efficient town clerk, and probably even prefers this hollow wisdom to the true wisdom of the great democratic creator in Athens known as Pericles. That sort of simpleton shouldn't be plagued with responsibility for his actions. He is far beyond the reach of such worries because he knows that no matter what the results are of his, quote, statesman-like confusions, his end has been written in the stars for a long time. Someday he will have to give in to another equally, quote, great mind. It's a sign of decay when the number of, quote, great statesmen increases as the quality of the individual statesman declines. So he's basically saying parliaments fill up with losers. And they all kind of know it, and none of them try very hard, and no great people are attracted to it as a result. The quality of the individual statesman is bound to become less important as his dependence on parliamentary majority grows. After all, Great minds will refuse to be the servant of silly incompetence and windbags. On the other hand, the representatives of the majority or the stupid hate nothing more than a superior brain. And I'm just going to point out that, allegedly Donald Trump, Melania at one point was asked, what does he hate most of all? And he said stupid. She said that he hates stupid people and stupidity most of all. And so we'll just let that paragraph sink in. The quality of the individual statesman is bound to become less important as its dependence on a parliamentary majority grows, because great minds refuse to be the servant of silly incompetence and windbags, but the representatives of the majority or the stupid hate nothing more than somebody smarter than them. And just, yeah. It is always a consoling feeling for one of these select men from some insignificant town to know that they have a leader whose wisdom is equal to their own. This way, each man occasionally has the pleasure of letting his intellect sparkle. So they're also going to prefer, when they're choosing a prime minister, let's say, somebody equally incompetent to themselves. So you got some yokel from some inconsequential town that has made it into the parliament as a representative, and he doesn't want somebody better than him to be his leader. He wants to be able to feel smart sometimes. So this way, each man occasionally has the pleasure of letting his intellect sparkle. Besides that, each citizen feels that he has the chance to one day rise to the top. If this other man of limited ability can do it, why not me? So everybody wants dumb parliament people because they think, well, if these idiots can be in parliament, I could be in parliament. If that man of limited ability can do it, why not me? If John can be boss, why not Paul? He writes, this new invention of democracy has a quality which recently has grown to be a real scandal. The cowardice of our so-called, quote, leadership is obvious. How lucky for them that when it comes to any decisions of importance, they can hide behind the skirts of the majority. Just take a close look at one of these political doormats. He begs for the approval of the majority for every action in order to guarantee he has an adequate number of accomplices so he can unload all responsibility. That is the main reason why this sort of political activity is disgusting and hateful to any decent and courageous man. It attracts the most contemptible characters. Anyone who will not take personal responsibility for his actions and runs for cover to avoid responsibility is a cowardly villain. So now he's saying parliaments fill up with cowardly villains. And I'm sure while I was reading that, and you were thinking of the Canadian Parliament, and you were like, that sounds right. Or you maybe were thinking of your state legislature. I don't know. Once a nation, he says, has put despicable leaders like these in place, the people's punishment will be swift. Representatives will no longer have the courage to make any decisions and would rather accept abuse, defamation, even dishonor, as long as they do not have to pull themselves together and make a real decision. After all, there is no one left who is ready to take responsibility for himself and carry a difficult decision through. And again, you're probably thinking about your state legislature or your parliament and thinking that sounds exactly like the freaking problem. Never forget, he says, that a majority cannot replace a man. A majority always represents stupidity and cowardice. 100 cowards do not make a hero any more than 100 fools make a wise man. The less responsibility the individual leader has, the more would-be politicians will feel they are called upon to devote their pitiful gifts to the nation. They are not even able to wait for their turn. They stand in a long line, sadly counting the people ahead of them and marking off the minutes until it will be their turn to board this political train. They wait a long time for any change in the office they have fixed their eye upon, and are grateful for any scandal which thins the ranks ahead of them. So he's talking about who becomes a parliamentarian. Oh, people who are looking for the guy, the incompetent boob that's in the office, to fall. So he's looking for the guy to suck. He wants the guy to suck, and then he's going to take advantage of anything he can to chip apart the guy ahead of him. Occasionally, someone refuses to move from his office, which makes the ones in line feel like There has almost been a violation of some sacred promise. Then they grow spiteful and do not rest until the bold politician holding on to their office is ousted. After that, he won't hold office again any time soon. If one of these creatures is forced to give up his post, he will immediately try to crowd into the waiting lines again. That is, unless he is prevented by the yelling and abuse from the others. Cough, cough, Thomas Massey. The result is an alarmingly rapid change in the important posts and offices, and the result is always bad and sometimes catastrophic. Fools and incompetents will not be the only victims of this custom, but the real leader will be affected if fate can still manage to put a true leader in this position. The moment people recognize him, they form a united front of resistance, especially if someone of any intelligence intrudes upon this group without rising from their own ranks. They want to keep every position of power among themselves, and they all hate every mind which might be a one among all the zeros. They may be dim-witted and slow in other areas, but in this one they are sharp and focused. The result is an ever-spreading intellectual wasteland in the government. For state and nation, the effect can easily be judged by anyone who is not one of these so-called leaders. So I'm telling you, I read this and I'm like, my God, I'm sitting there thinking about state legislatures. I'm thinking about the houses of Congress, the dysfunction in Congress, the House of Representatives being like a kind of a shit show. I'm thinking of everything I've tried to do to help Canadians in particular more than anybody else in their parliament. And I'm just like, oof, dude's kind of got it, right? And then I have that realization. Hitler is offering a solution to this problem. And the solution he picked resulted in a tyranny, World War II, murder of innocent people, including his own people, and the Holocaust. And then the American founders put forth a different method for dealing with this same problem, the weakness of a parliament, which is a federal system that has three co-equal branches, including an executive branch, and locking the parliamentary thing to the legislature alone. No executive function involved. Pretty interesting. Hitler goes on. Old Austria had parliamentary government in its purest form. The prime minister was appointed by the emperor and king, but even this appointment was simply the will of parliament, and the trading of favors for individual posts was typical, just as in Western democracy. Okay, so here he's making an interesting contrast. The executive of the parliament is the prime minister. The head executive, at least, we'll call him the executive of the government, is the prime minister. And he says in Old Austria, the king or the emperor actually appointed this guy. So an executive appoints an executive for the executive to do it. Now, the thing is that person comes out of the ranks of parliament. He's not appointed from outside of parliament. He's appointed from inside of parliament. So he's elected by the same processes, so it's not good, but at least he was appointed. But then he says, but that was corrupt too, because the appointment was arranged basically by the games played in parliament, trading of favors, etc., so that the right guy got appointed and whatever. Now, in other parliaments, like the Canadian one, it's a little bit different, and in the British one, it's a little bit different. They have different ways of choosing their prime minister, but he's still a creature of the parliament, and who becomes prime minister is still caught up in the trading of favors, blah, 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 all throughout. So this is his essential critique. He says, well, at least they had their executive appointed differently, but no, it's okay. It's still corrupt as hell. It doesn't work, and it's still all about trading of favors and all the same bullshit, and it's coming from the ranks of these defunct losers who are still part of the parliament that have all the wrong selection pressures on them, and all the wrong pressures once you get selected on the inside. He says the intervals between the replacement of one person by another gradually become shorter, finally ending up in a wild relay chase to see who could gain the office first. Each change reduced the quality of the statesman until finally only the petty type of political juggler remained. The qualities of statesmanship in these people were valued according to their skill in piecing together one temporary alliance after another, and in their ability to manipulate the pettiest political deals. This is the only kind of political activity suited to the abilities of these representatives. And again, you're probably like, it's very uncomfortable how accurately he's describing the problems of my parliament or legislature. The city of Vienna, he said, became a school which offered the best insights in the field. So he's learning watching this. I was very interested in comparing the knowledge and ability of these popular representatives with the jobs they were supposed to be doing. This was necessary in order to understand the intellectual horizon of those who were chosen by the people. One could not help but think seriously about the processes that discovered these, quote, magnificent figures in our public life, end quote. It was worthwhile to thoroughly study how the real talents of these gentlemen were used in the service of their country. In other words, to analyze thoroughly the step-by-step procedure. So he's saying, I went to Vienna, I started to watch the parliament. This was very educational. That's what he's saying. And you start looking at this shit show, more or less is what he's saying, and you start wondering, how did these people get here, and how do they operate, and how does this work? And he says you can't help but think about it, because basically what he's saying is it's such a shit show, you have to wonder how in the world this is the case. And that's where he's drawing all these conclusions from. And again, his ultimate conclusion is the only solution to this is going to be a dictatorship, and the American experiment is the refutation to that claim. And we see how history played out through, we'll say, 1945 or so, and since to kind of establish that. He says, we must be objective in considering an institution whose members think it is necessary to refer to, quote, objectivity in every other sentence as the only just basis for any judgment or belief. So this is almost like political correctness culture. He's like, there's some objectivity that objectively this, objectively that, every other sentence, and there's no other tool for judgment or belief. So there's some prim and proper standard by which everybody has to make all their decisions. He says, anyone who examines these gentlemen for themselves can only be astonished at the result. The parliamentary life looked more and more desolate as one penetrated its structure and studied the people and principles of the system in a spirit of ruthless objectivity. So you might actually call that positivity if you want, or positivism, which is, of course, what you then see you see massive critiques of both on the left and on the radical right. If you do consider the matter with absolute objectivity, Hitler tells us, the parliamentary principle is wrong. There is no other principle as wrong as the parliamentary principle. We can say this without even referring to the way the election of the honorable deputies takes place, the way that they get into office, the way titles are given to them. Only in a tiny fraction of cases are the offices filled based on widespread desire, and certainly does not stem from any need. It is obvious to anyone that the political understanding of the masses has not reached the point where they can arrive at political views on their own. They are incapable of picking out the most qualified person. What we always call public opinion is based only on individual experience or knowledge. Most public opinion results from the way public matters are presented to the people through an overwhelmingly impressive system of controlled information. Just as religious beliefs are the result of education, the political opinion of the masses is the result of an often incredibly thorough and determined assault on the mind and soul. So here's one of these cases where he's right in the narrow sense and all messed up. He's saying, look, the masses are too stupid to vote for the representatives, so of course they're not going to make good representatives or choose good representatives. And even if there were good ones to choose from, they're never going to choose the right thing because they're not capable of doing it. And even if they were capable, the problem is they barely understand politics, and then the information they get is massively contoured misinformation and disinformation, an overwhelmingly impressive system of controlled information, which he lays at the feet of the Jewish press. We would lay at the feet of the mainstream media, CNN, and etc. But even the alt media is now, as we're all learning, controlled media. And so I think this last sentence is in fact interesting. Just as religious beliefs are the result of education, so take that how you will, the political opinion of the masses is the result of an often incredibly thorough and determined assault on the mind and soul. And you probably resonate with that. By far, he says, the greater part of political education or propaganda is the work of the press. So now we're going to take a sidebar and talk about propaganda, political propaganda for the parliamentary system. He says, it is the press which primarily takes care of the work of enlightenment and asks, that's definitely sarcasm, and acts as a sort of school for adults. This means the teaching materials are not in the hands of the state, but in the clutches of characters who are motivated by their own interests. As a young man, Vienna gave me the best opportunities to become intimately acquainted with the owners and manufacturers of this mass education machine. At first, I was astonished to see how quickly this evil power succeeded in producing a particular opinion among the public, even though the meaning may be twisted or a flat-out false representation of a public desire. A few days were enough to turn some ridiculous affair into a momentous act of state, while vital problems were generally forgotten or simply erased from the memory of the masses. Again, we're having resonant material. He says, okay, so like what really happens is that if you want political education for adults and civic education for adults, it's happening through the press. The press is not controlled by the state, which he thinks is a good thing, it should be, but rather by private interests, which diverge all over the place. The American idea is that if we have competing interests providing information, then there's this thing we generally call the marketplace of ideas. The best ideas win, criticism shuts down bad ideas, etc. Hitler's not a big fan of that. But he says that this is actually, in either case, a mass education machine, and that it's an evil power, he says, and what it does is it produces opinion. Okay, so this is like the precursor to his propaganda machine that he talks about in chapter 6, right? And he says, oh my God, they take all these events and they misrepresent them. They misrepresent the public desire and all of it. They completely misrepresent things, and they amplify big, dumb, little stories into big, dumb affairs that eat up all of our attention and distract everybody, while really important problems get glazed over or forgotten, or things get memory hold, even literally, or simply erased from the memory of the masses. He literally says that the important stuff that they don't want people to know gets memory hold by the press. And you're thinking, oh wow. But remember, he slipped in there what his solution was. His solution is that this means the teaching materials are not in the hands of the state, but in the clutches of characters who are motivated by their own interests. So he wants the state to control the press to make sure that, it's only the right information. And then you look at Canada and its parliamentary system and the educational materials of the press being completely in the hands of the state, and you think, oh no, something is not right about that. And so we have this difficult debate always going on about free speech, about censorship, about information, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, And what do? How do we contour the idea of information warfare and so on social media? We always have this debate, and you have people that call themselves free speech absolutists who believe that, we should always be defending the right for people to speak, and that more good speech is the answer to some bad speech, not censorship. My take on this is actually that any apparatus that is capable of censoring lies is also capable of deciding that the truth is a lie that needs to be censored and then censoring it. So you're handing off the authority to selectively determine what can and cannot get to you and to somebody else who has their own agenda. And it could be the state. Hitler, of course, thinks the state is the natural incorporation and extension of the folk, and therefore that's naturally and good. But that's basically turning the state not just into a propaganda machine of the party in power, the party in action, but also into an echo chamber, a reflexive echo chamber that amplifies any errors that the state already believes, it amplifies them and feeds it back. It's like when a microphone points at a speaker and starts screaming, right? But anyway, he's calling out the press in a way that feels resonant, and then he offers a solution, which is the state should control the press. And I think we're all like, wait, whatever, that's not good. In our system, though, we are clear that there are problems. We are clear that like bad ideas proliferate, bad ideas can go viral, bad ideas can grab hold of people might never. We see where the false information goes completely viral and the correction issued by the newspaper later gets ignored. We see all kinds of problems. It's hard to correct misinformation. People catch on to emotionally driven stuff and ignore logical refutations, or maybe just never see them, etc., etc., etc. And yet we still in the American system defend this idea of free speech as the greatest safeguard against the fact that anybody who can control the nature of speech can decide that true things are false and make sure you never see them, which is so risky that it is better to allow people to say lies, to constitutionally defend the right to pronounce a lie, as well as to protect the right for people to refute that lie, and to have the messy rough and tumble of that kind of a system. And I would defend that to the death. So I think that's right and that Hitler is wrong. But you see, again, the same theme arising. There's a real problem. People recognize the real problem. There's a very tempting solution, which is this basically censorship apparatus controlled by the party in action, the so-called good people, the folk, whatever. And that was the road Hitler took. And thank God that we have a different road that we are taking here as a natural response. He says, in the course of a few weeks, the press could conjure up names out of nothing and attaching the incredible hopes of the public to them. Do you feel that one on the American conservative circumstance, guys? Like, all of a sudden we have all these brand new stars and like they're on the stage at Turning Point USA like next week. In the course of a few weeks, the press could conjure up names out of nothing and attach the incredible hopes of the public to them. Suddenly they would become more popular than a really important man may ever enjoy in a lifetime. These were names which no one had even heard of only a month before. If you're in the American or even other conservative movements in the world listening to this, it's a good time to hang your head in shame. At the same time, old and stable figures of government or public life simply ceased to exist as far as the world was concerned, or they were buried under such rudeness that their names soon risked becoming symbols of wickedness or dishonesty. Let's just do the hanging our head in shame thing again. If we are to understand this process, we have to study this infamous Jewish way of magically drenching the clean garments of honorable men with the slop buckets of filthy libel and slander from hundreds of directions at once. We must study it if we are to understand the real danger from these journalistic villains. Notice he just calls this a Jewish thing, which is projection, just straight projection. There is nothing these intellectual newspaper rogues would not do if it allowed him to accomplish his disrespectful ends. He sniffs his way into the most secret family affairs, and he does not rest until his nosiness has rooted up some awful situation which will serve to cook the unlucky victim's goose. If he does not uncover anything in public or private life, he resorts to slander. That is, he just makes it up. He has a deeply rooted belief that some of it will stick, even if there are 1,000 contradictions in his claims. After it is repeated 100 times by all his accomplices, the victim usually can't put up a fight at all. This pack of scoundrels will never admit their actions affect mankind, and they certainly would never admit that they even understand what they are doing. So again, same point, lots of resonance. Hitler's not got a good solution to the problem, but you're like, yeah, that's how it works. Oh my God. Heaven forbid, Hitler says. These idle and dishonest people are like squids that hide in a cloud of truth, proclaiming, quote, journalistic duty and other lies while attacking the rest of the world in the sneakiest way possible. They congregate at congressional meetings and conventions to confirm the tedious talk about their journalistic duty and the honor they do to society. Then the species bows to pay their respects to one another, and with it they end their meeting. This insidious group manufactures more than 2/3 of all so-called public opinion, and this is where the parliament obtains their strength. All right, so now quick pause. He's like screaming about the fake news. We hear from not just the woke right, but from a lot of people, you don't hate journalists enough, and he's basically doing the you don't hate journalists enough routine for 3 or 4 paragraphs here. It's you don't hate journalists enough. Now, it's the same story. This is the point I want to make. We have the same story, which is you don't hate journalists enough, therefore we'll be your new journalist now, is both Hitler's answer and the woke right's alt media answer, rather than you don't hate journalists enough, including this new crackpot journalist program that's calling itself whatever, as journalists too. What it actually should be is that everybody speaks to the best of their ability and that we're all skeptical of all media figures and all of their agendas. But that's not what Hitler is saying. Hitler says it should be in the hands of the state, and that's not what the woke right is saying. And they're saying you can't trust CNN, so you should trust my show instead. I think people should hunt down primary source documents. I think people should try to get to the best understanding of the truth that they can, and that they should assume that all journalists have some kind of a agenda. But anyway, he ends up saying that this insidious group, meaning journalists, manufactures more than 2/3 of all so-called public opinion, and this is where Parliament obtains their strength, he says. To describe all of this in detail and prove its lies and falsehoods would take volumes, Hitler contends. But putting all this aside, if we just look at the product and its effect, I think it will be enough to show how this crazy business works. in such a way that even the most innocent and skeptical person will understand. The quickest and easiest way to understand this senseless and dangerous deviance is by comparing democratic parliament systems with a genuine German democracy. Okay, so now he's going to put out the hints of an alternative. I'm actually not going to go too much into this alternative. We know what that ended up looking like for him. That's the Nazi experiment. Instead, what I'm going to do is, what he's going to do is spend a few more pages ranting about how crappy parliaments are, allegedly in comparison, even though it's mostly him just ranting about how bad parliaments are. So we get a few more pages of this, and we will turn a corner. A body of 500 men, he says, or even recently women, is chosen whose duty is to make a final decision on all kinds of issues. So there's your parliament. They alone are effectively the government. Once again, we thank God that we have three co-equal branches that check each other in the United States. Even though they may choose a cabinet which on the outside is supposed to manage the affairs of state, this is only for show. By the way, I'll just throw out there, just to remind people, that the reason we have three co-equal branches of government, we have the court system set up the way that it is, we have an executive system, and we have a legislative system separately, is all actually in the Hebrew Bible that the founders studied. This is a Jewish concept that is the cornerstone of America that distinguishes it from this Euro slop in both directions, the thing Hitler's criticizing and the thing Hitler wants to replace what he's criticizing with, both of which are wrong answers. Just to remind you of the actually Judeo-Christian American roots of what we're trying to defend being the right answer. 1 hyphen, Judeo-Christian, makes them mad. 2 hyphens should really piss them off good. Judeo-Christian American system is what we're looking for. And this system that is the answer that we're like, thank goodness we have this here in America and didn't fall into the Euroslop problem or fall into the Euroslop reactionary solution. Thank goodness that we didn't do that, is based off of the Hebrew Bible's concept of just and proper government. Isn't that amazing? Okay, but they alone, the parliament alone, are effectively the government, even though they may choose a cabinet. That's only for show, he says. In reality, the government cannot take any step without first getting permission from the General Assembly. Consequently, it is not responsible for anything, since the final decision does not rest with anyone in the government, but with the majority of Parliament. In any case, the government simply carries out the will of this majority. Its political capacity can really only be judged by its skill in either conforming to the will of the majority or convincing the majority to switch to its side. This reduces it from being a real government, that governs, by the way, to being a beggar at the feet of the majority. Its most urgent job is to gain the favor of the existing majority or to set up a more agreeable new majority. If it succeeds, it can continue the political game for a little while longer. If it does not succeed, it must quit. Whether its intentions are right or wrong is not even considered. This eliminates all responsibility for anyone's actions or decisions. And sadly, again, we look at our legislatures, we look at the parliaments, he's kind of right. Again, narrowly right, his solution wasn't so good. It does not take a lot of thinking, he says, to figure out what the results will be. The 500 representatives of the people present a disjointed and usually a pitiful picture if you look at their dissimilar occupations or their varied political abilities. Surely no one would assume that those elected by the nation are chosen because of their ability to reason or their intellect. I hope no one is foolish enough to think that hundreds of statesmen can emerge from ballot boxes which have been stuffed by those who themselves only possess an average intelligence. We can never denounce sharply enough the silly idea that geniuses are discovered through general elections. I find this paragraph to be rather hilarious, by the way, and it's about to get really funny, in my opinion. One of the best lines in the whole book. The average nation only finds a real statesman once in a blue moon, not 100 at a time. The masses will oppose any outstanding genius because it is their instinct. A camel can pass through the eye of a needle sooner than a great man can be discovered by an election. History has always shown that those who rose above the average level did so through the driving force of an individual personality. Now we have 500 people of mere modest ability voting on the most important issues of the nation and installing a government which requires the approval of the exalted 500. This government, in turn, learns that to secure its position it must carry out the policy of the 500. Unfortunately, the policy is actually created by 500 people and it carries the same shabby appearance. Like, that's about as savage and accurate a critique of a parliament as you can pretty much read. Like I said, it's a little polemical. He's a little biased. They do better than this, but that's a pretty savage critique, if I must say so myself. And this is the What Hitler Got Right podcast episode of the New Discourses Podcast. On the other hand, I will point out that this is one of those points where it's like, oh my gosh, right? When we talk about whether or not the voters can find a great man, it doesn't seem to apply for their representatives. But when we bring the voters together to elect a president, a leader, it might. It might. In fact, we do occasionally elect rather tremendous statesmen to the U.S. presidency. And have done so in the past. In fact, the mediocrity problem seems to be one that's pretty well strongly contained to Congress, and it's probably because of the same selection pressures and conditions that Hitler's complaining about here apply to a body of that kind. But when the people are allowed to elect their leader directly, which is kind of what he would say is the good thing in a German democracy. Remember, we're comparing this against a German democracy that I may or may not read any of. The American democracy system, we elect our executives separately, and this actually doesn't perfectly work, but it kind of works. And we actually can select executives because we vote for executives on executive capacities, and we vote for legislators on legislative capacities, which apparently suffer some problems. And so this is kind of one of those moments where you're like, Hitler's like, sweep this whole stupid thing from the board and let's have a dictatorship. Whereas in America, they're like, no, let's have an executive and a legislative branch, and let's like make them check each other so that neither of them has absolute power and can become a dictator and actually be the government. Neither one is the government. They're both checking each other. It's kind of an interesting and brilliant system that they came up with in the 1770s and 1780s. Even if there were no question, Hitler says, about the ability of these representatives, we must remember how varied the problems are that are waiting to be solved, and in how many totally separate fields answers and decisions have to be given. We can easily understand how worthless a government institution is that entrusts the right to make a final decision to a mass meeting of people, among whom only a few have any knowledge and experience in the matter being discussed. This is basically the administrative state question that we're dealing with now, because this is the solution that we've come up with. The problem is that the legislature has to approve, in the U.S., the Congress has to approve of a lot of things, and the congressmen themselves are not experts in those things, so how are they supposed to make good decisions? Of course, there's lobbyists and all of this, but how are they to make good decisions? And if it's on an issue that they're not actually experts in, they have committees, they have this, they have that. But one of the solutions that we've done is to move a lot of this into the executive branch, which is actually executing things, and Congress is given broad approval for us to write policies. This is the administrative state question, and the administrative state itself is this great benefit and massive problem at the same time. So you have a department, say, of agriculture that deals with agricultural issues. It's, in theory, filled with experts in agriculture. This, of course, creates revolving doors. We saw the problems there with the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, and so on, that the bureaucratic expert class becomes this monster that we all have to deal with. The revolving doors, the corruption, the conflicts of interest all become real. But at the same time, it's trying to address this question of how do you get a bunch of 500 average people that got sent as representatives by their local constituencies to be able to weigh in on every possible issue: agriculture, medicine, space, all these high-tech things. He says, the most important economic measures are being presented to a forum where only a tenth of the members have any economic training. This is simply putting the final decision on an important matter in the hands of men who lack the skills to deal with it intelligently. And this is the challenge that we have to figure out. I mean, it's not to say that Hitler's solution didn't involve an administrative state. It did. It was under the Führer principle. So he would have definitely had something like an agricultural department with agricultural experts and so on. And it would have worked under the administrative state kind of structure. And whether or not that would have become a corrupt body, answer is yes. Yes, I said it would have. The question becomes, though, how do you actually come up with a sophisticated government in a complicated situation, with a complicated modern situation with like lots of high-tech things going on that kind of like no generalist really fully understands. But he's saying there's no way a parliament can work because of this problem. It cannot be the government because basically you have incompetent people deciding on most of the things they have to decide on, some of which are very important. So that one's a semi-unfair critique because other modern states have figured this out. You do have different cabinet departments that actually do deal with these things with actual specialists, and they all start to suffer from the bureaucratic administrative state problems and corruptions that we haven't figured out a solution to, and maybe there's not a solution to, I don't know. He goes on, this is how it ends with every question. Things are always settled by a majority of ignoramuses and incompetence, since the membership of this institution never truly changes. Now, notice he said earlier that it changes faster and faster. What does he mean? He means that when you get a new person in, they're basically the same guy. The problems presented extend to almost every field of public life and would require a constant change of parliamentary leaders to judge and vote on them. After all, it is impossible to let the same people deal with matters of transportation with a question of important foreign policy. Otherwise, they would all have to be geniuses in every area, and this does not happen once in centuries. Even worse, they are not brains at all, but only narrow, conceited, and arrogant amateurs and intellectual pretenders of the worst sort. I think most of us mostly agree, although I've met some very impressive Congress people, very impressive. I've met some recently, in fact, and was kind of blown away. I generally have this expectation of my elected representatives in legislatures, and every now and then I meet some that are actually truly competent people in a kind of a shocking way. In fact, Hitler says that is the reason for the incomprehensible carelessness that these ruling classes display when they make decisions on matters that even the greatest minds would find stressful. Measures of vital importance for the whole state, actually the fate of the people and the entire race, notice this emphasis on race, are treated as if they are a game of sheep's head or tarot, which would be a more suitable pursuit for such people. And this is a card game. Sheep's head is a card game. Tarot is tarot cards, like you know about for divining. So he's just insulting and saying that they treat these things like they're not really important. Of course, it would be unfair to say every deputy in Parliament has no sense of responsibility. That is not the case at all, but by forcing the individual member to make up his mind on questions which are not in the realm of his talents, the system gradually corrupts the character of every member. Now remember, in the Führer principle that he actually advocates for, the entire state is a rigid administrative state. So these different departments are wholly responsible for their area of expertise, and they answer to a guy who's administratively above him that all eventually ends up at the Führer at the top of the pyramid. Okay, so for him, there's no parliament of random people that got elected to make decisions on behalf of the government. There's an agricultural department that's like our administrative Department of Agriculture that does all of the decisions to do with agriculture, and he answers to a guy above him who might be directly the Führer or in his inner circle or whatever else. Okay, so nobody is going to have the courage in this system of parliament to say, gentlemen, I do not think we know anything about this matter. I personally, at any rate, certainly do not. It would not make any difference if he did state his objection, because that kind of frankness would not be understood in this crowd, and people would not let such an honest ass spoil everyone else's game. Anyone who knows human nature will understand that in such a situation, nobody likes to be the dunce, and in certain circles, honesty is a symptom for stupidity. So a representative who begins by being honorable is forced down the crowded path of lies and cheating. He believes that an individual withdrawing from a decision would not make any difference in the eventual outcome of the group decision, and this kills every honest impulse that a person may feel. He will end up telling himself that he personally is far from the worst, and that by joining in he might prevent worse things from happening. Some may object by saying, even though the individual deputy may not have any special understanding of a particular matter, his belief is based on the direction given by his party and by his politics. The party has its separate committees, and he feels they are more than sufficiently informed by experts. At first glance, this seems to be true, but then comes the question, why choose 500 when just a few of them possess the necessary wisdom needed to adopt a policy in important matters? Yes, he says, there is the true difficulty in the whole system. The basis of our present democratic parliament is not to form an assembly of wise men, but instead put together a herd of nobodies who are dependent on the intellect of everyone around them. I know we're getting a little Baroque here. We've done this. We've beaten this horse to death, but this is still his essential argument, that everybody there is basically incompetent and nobody has any responsibility. They become easier to lead, he says, in a certain direction as their abilities decrease. This is the only way party politics can be carried on. This is the only way it is possible for the puppeteer to remain hidden in the background without ever being personally held accountable for what he does. Then every decision, no matter how harmful to the nation, is blamed on a whole party and not just one mischievous culprit pulling the strings. All responsibility disappears because responsibility can only exist if an individual makes a decision and not an association of parliamentary windbags. It's a fair critique. This is actually, I think, one of the core problems is the ultimate diffusion of responsibility. He goes on a little bit more colorfully. Only an evil creature of the night, fearful of daylight, could approve of this institution, while every honest man who accepts personal responsibility for his own actions must find it disgusting. Consequently, this kind of democracy has become the tool of that race whose real purpose forces it to hide its actions from sunlight where others might see now and forever. Only the Jew can praise an institution as dirty and deceptive as himself. Okay, so here we've gone on for pages and pages and pages about him telling how bad it all is in a parliament, and then he stops with, he doesn't stop, he stops that particular critique with it being only the Jews would operate such a system. No parliamentarian has any responsibility. So now you have Jews back in the shadows pulling the strings. You might have figured that's where it's going. We're talking about the string pulling. You have Jews pulling the strings, and then the string, nobody ever has to take any blame. So the Jews can take advantage of a parliament to destroy everything. This, of course, is Hitlerian crazy shit. This is not a good critique of a parliament. But it doesn't have to be Jews. There are actually special. The general problem is not Jews. When you're not Hitler, is special interests can actually be doing this, and the special interest can influence the parliamentarian or the legislator, who then goes into a responsibility-free zone of the parliament himself and makes bad decisions for the nation, has no responsibility for it, and behind the scenes with some special interest. That is a general and not unfair critique, but calling that Jewish is obviously completely unfair. Let's see, and is that where I was going to stop? Because the next part he says, on the other side we have the true Germanic democracy consisting of a free election. I think this is actually instructive. This leader is bound to assume full responsibility for everything he does. Now I want you to, when you hear this, remember he means like a dictator, but in the U.S. system, that's our executive, our president, or at the state level, our governors. On the other side, we have the true Germanic democracy consisting of a free election. This leader is bound to assume full responsibility for everything he does. In this format, there is no roll call of a majority on individual questions, but only the rule of an individual who has to support his decisions with his property and his life. To anyone who objects by saying no one would be willing to devote himself to such a risky responsibility under those conditions, there is but one answer: thank God. It is the very purpose of a Germanic democracy to keep every unworthy political climber who might by chance fall into the office from gaining any power in the government of his fellow man through the back door. The very magnitude of this responsibility is meant to scare off weaklings and incompetents. Now, I don't know if that really works in the German system or in the American presidency, but it's interesting enough. He goes on to say, if such a fellow should try to sneak in any way, it's easier to find and harshly punish him. Get away, you coward. Step away. You are stinking up the stairway. The front steps to the pantheon of history are not for cowards, but for heroes. I arrived at this opinion after watching the Vienna Parliament for 2 years. Then I stopped going. Parliamentary government was largely responsible for the ever-increasing weakness of the old Habsburg state during the previous few years. Then he bitches about the collapse of the Germans, the German supremacy, actually, literally German supremacy in the situation. I'm supposed to scroll down a little bit here. The complete collapse of Parliament, he eventually gets to this. The complete collapse of Parliament was only prevented by giving in to humiliating concessions that consisted of inappropriate demands. Of course, the Germans had to foot the bill. And so that's where he's like, maybe I actually wanted to read this German supremacy paragraph. It's one extra paragraph. Let me just read that. The more its work, meaning the parliament that he hates, the more its work shattered German supremacy in Austria, the more a system of playing one nationality against another gained ground, and the parliament building itself, this was always at the expense of the Germans and eventually at the expense of the empire. By the turn of the century, it had to have been obvious to any fool that the central force of the monarchy could no longer overcome the individual country's attempts to break loose. On the contrary, the more terrible the methods became that were used by the state for self-preservation, the more universally the state was hated. In Hungary and in the individual Slavic provinces, the people did not identify themselves with the monarchy, so they did not feel its weakness was shameful to them. Instead, they were rather pleased at the signs of senility because they preferred the monarchy's death to its recovery. This complete collapse of the parliament was only prevented by giving in to humiliating concessions that consisted of inappropriate demands, and of course the Germans had to foot the bill. So now he's taken his whole complaint against the parliaments and come full circle. Everything's eventually going to collapse, and of course the Germans could have saved it, and the Germans are the ones who end up having to pay for it. We're not going to get into the details of all of this, German supremacy stuff. That's really the conclusion of Hitler's criticism of parliaments. This is what Hitler got right. It's not very big, it's not very broad, but a couple of important points about how parliaments work and about how I'm not as convinced about the one about them voting on things they don't really understand, but I am about the selection methods and the types of people that tend to occupy those positions. And it's a little bit polemical, like I said. It's ideologically anti-democracy, and it's not totally fair, but it's strong on that narrow point that parliaments are a weak form of government, and if they're the main form of government, you have a problem. Once again, kind of the big point that we're making here, or a big point, is here you see Hitler can be right on a narrow point and wrong broadly. He can be right in a way about the institution he's complaining about. He can say that the current system is messed up, but his solution to it turns out to be wrong. It's the Führer principle. It's this dictatorial system that he wants to set up to replace the parliament. And like I said, as I read through this, I laughed, I cried, I thought it was hilarious. And mostly apropos, but at the same time, I thanked my lucky stars. I'm an American, and I live in a system where we have a system of divided powers with a chief executive who's elected by the people, whose power is checked, but also independent of the Congress, which operates like a two-house parliamentary system, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into all the details of how the American system works, and of course, there's the judiciary to check both of them and make sure they stay constitutional. But I was very glad to be American looking at this. So here, Hitler, just to kind of summarize and kind of get to the end, Hitler spends a few pages, I'm going to read a little bit more in a minute, ranting about all the various injustices that the Germans faced and how their stupid Austrian system wasn't going to work, and then settles in on this discussion about how the Habsburgs got very nasty and turned on the German element following the Franco-Prussian War, and that really set the Austrian Empire on a bad course. And that Franco-Prussian War was in 1870 to 1871, so we're talking about 40 years earlier. You have a war, Franco-Prussian War, and then the Habsburgs turn on the German element, and that, in his opinion, is what leads ultimately to the mass decline, because the strong element of the German element in the middle of the Austrian Empire is now out of the picture. So instead, he starts talking about the Habsburgs sided with the Slavs against the Germans, and the Germans were only saved by fate itself because of the collapse of their state. So it's like this kind of weird story. Like World War I was horrible for the Germans, but it wasn't that bad because we would have been destroyed had it not been for the collapse of the Austrian state that World War I brought about. But there's kind of a final point that's worth making again, and he gives a short articulation of it. And that point is that when something's wrong, there's not only one solution, and the most obvious solution is not always the right solution. So Hitler chose the Nazi experiment in response to the idea of the weaknesses of the parliamentary system that he diagnoses pretty well. And the American experiment stands in stark contrast, or divided powers. There's a British experiment that he's even nodded to, right? And he even said that the British experiment, the British Parliament, is a more noble example. And in fact, it's a counterexample to his polemic. So there's not just one solution to a problem. So if you're out there listening, it's like, don't leap on one possible, proffered solution. The guy that's ranting about a problem might not be the best guy to have a solution. You say, James, that's you. All you do is complain. I hear that a lot, right? You don't have solutions. Like, okay, so first of all, sometimes I do, but and some people think I do, but here's the thing. I don't even claim to. My job that I claim to have is to inform people on the circumstances that they have. I'm like Google Translate for woke, right? Like, Google Translate doesn't have a solution. Like, if you read a set of instructions in Chinese and you don't know what it says, and you put it in Google Translate and now you know what it says, a service has been rendered, but it didn't tell you what you're supposed to do. The instructions do, right? I'm just trying to help people understand the world around them and the context in which things are happening, whether it's woke right, as we're talking about a lot when we talk about the Nazi experiment, whether it's woke left, when we're talking about all the communist stuff, whether it's all this weird globalist stuff, whether it's Dugin's weird crap, the Russians, the psyops and all of that, United Nations, who knows? There's all kinds of things that I'm trying to give people color on. Read page 64 and finish the paragraph that carries over to page 65, plus the next one about nerds. Okay, so that's what I'm supposed to read next. That made sense when I wrote it, but now you get a taste of what my notes look like for myself. Okay, read page 64. The pan-German movement of German Austria, this is Hitler, in the 1890s receives credit for clearly and unmistakably realizing that a state has the right to demand respect for its authority only when it is for the protection and in the interests of its people, or at least will not cause any harm. State authority cannot exist as an end in itself, or any kind of tyranny would become sacred and untouchable. It's an irony that he says that, right? Because that's actually his solution, but he's doing the trick that the communists do too, but in a very different way. The communists do it in a completely different way. But the trick is, no, this is for the people. We're for the people, right? So you can't just have a tyranny. It has to be it says the state, we cannot make the mistake of believing the state has a right to demand respect for its authority unless it's for the protection and in the interest of its people, right? Okay, so that's why he's going to have his folkish government. If the government is driving a nationality to its destruction, he says, the rebellion of every member of that people is not merely a right, but a duty. So this is why this is really interesting, because this actually sounds like the American stuff. This actually sounds like the Declaration of Independence, but of course Hitler didn't do what the Declaration of Independence did, or what the Constitution did afterwards. He does something very different with a similar sentiment. So if the government is driving a nationality to its destruction, remember for him though, nationality means a race. It is a folk. Okay, the rebellion of every member of that people is not merely a right, but a duty. Whether or not this condition exists is not shown by theoretical stories, but it is shown when force is used against the people and in the success of effort to suppress the nationality. Of course, he's talking about the Germans being suppressed by the Austrians as the context here. Of course, every governing power claims their responsibilities to uphold the authority of the state, no matter how badly they have abused that authority, even though it has betrayed the interests of a nationality 1,000 times over. Again, nationality means a race. In fighting such a power and in winning freedom or independence, the people's instinct for self-preservation will have to use the same weapon used by its adversary. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to read that. In fighting such a power, the people's instinct for self-preservation, so the race preserving itself is what that actually means, will have to use the same weapon used by its adversary. So if we're being attacked by woke, we've got to use woke back at it, right? That is to say, the battle will be carried on by legal means, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, as long as the power which is being overthrown also uses legal methods, but the insurgents should not hesitate to use illegal means if the oppressor employs them. Okay, so all of a sudden, we'll play by the law if and only if you play by the law, but if the enemy stops playing by the law, we're not going to play by the law either, he says. And this actually becomes very important because that's his whole shtick, is he's going to overthrow the existing law and establish a new one. Never forget, he says, that the highest purpose of a man's existence is the preservation of his own kind, that means race, and not the maintenance of a state or government. Sounds very woke right. The government exists for the people, not the other way around. The question of legality, he says, is secondary if the survival of the race is at stake, and they may be pushed aside or destroyed. Even though the methods used by the ruling power are 1,000 times legal, the self-preservation of the oppressed is always the most noble justification for a struggle using any and every weapon. Now there we are, right? Okay. Even though the methods used by the ruling power are 1,000 times legal, the self-preservation of the oppressed. I was told that these people don't have an oppressed mindset, and they're not victims, and they're not woke. But the self-preservation of the oppressed is always the most noble justification for a struggle using any and every weapon. So, okay, if you see yourself as a victim in your race, then you can be woke, is what he's saying. And I mean that literally, because you can use any and every method. You can lie, you can cheat, you can be violent, you can do whatever. The truth of this statement can be seen by anyone, he says, and this Earth's history shows tremendous examples in the wars of independence against inward or outward enslavement of peoples. So here we have, kind of that woke grandiosity about what's going on, and we have the woke mentality that the ends justify the means when you have oppression. And I wanted you to hear that for sure. The law of humanity, he says, is above the law of the state. However, if a people are defeated in their struggle for human rights, this means those people are not favored on the scale of fate and that they are not slated to remain in this world. The world will not be possessed by those who are weak-willed. Okay, so the law, if you decide to fight for your human rights and you lose, nature didn't want you. Fate it didn't need you. You were too weak. You didn't deserve to continue to exist. Using Austria as a clear and striking example, it is easy to see how a tyranny can wrap itself up in so-called legality. And this is yet another interesting point. The legal power of the state once rested with the anti-German foundation of the parliament, with its non-German majority, and on the equally anti-German ruling house. That would be the House of Habsburg. These elements embodied the entire authority of the state. Any attempt to change the German-Austrian people through these groups would have been nonsense. Consequently, our admirers of the, quote, legal way as the only, quote, permissible one, and those admirers of the state's authority itself were bound to think that all resistance must be abandoned because it could not be carried on by legal means. This would have inevitably meant a quick end to the German people under the monarchy. The German element was saved from that fate only by the collapse of the state. The theorist with his thick glasses hanging off his nose would rather die for his doctrines than for his people. He believes that since man made laws for himself, men should thereafter exist for the laws. To the credit of the pan-German movement in Austria, which I didn't tell you about, and to the horror of all amateur theoreticians and other state worshippers, the pan-German movement swept away this nonsense. Okay, so that was as far as I wanted to go. And so this is after the end of that paragraph, say something like, so I'm supposed to say something here. And so the rest was history, right? So the pan-German movement is the one that's rising out of the ashes of this collapse after World War I, and the rest was history. There was a new tyranny, another world war, and a Holocaust. That's what came as a result of deciding that they didn't need to be bound by legal means, that their people were oppressed and were therefore justified in doing whatever they wanted or needed. So the point is, of course, that how we look, so parliaments are weak forms of government and they're filled with nonsense, and it made Hitler angry, and it makes a lot of people angry every day. But how we sweep away nonsense matters, and it matters a lot. Hitler's way did not work. Hitler's way, the Nazi experiment, was a catastrophe. That there is nonsense afoot or bad things going on, injustices happening, is not on its own sufficient justification for sweeping it away by any means, only to replace it with something horrible just because it's different. This error has been made over and over and over again in history, whether it was people supporting the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Maoists in China, or just about every other example of a catastrophic tyrant that you can think of, whether communist, fascist, or otherwise. People said, what we have is intolerable, anything will be better, and we're justified to do whatever we have to do to get it. And it turns out the thing that they installed was not better. Sometimes there are things worth preserving. Sometimes the conservative line of maintaining the culture that got you to this point is really worth something. Sometimes it's a renewal of values that's needed, not a new system. And so what we learned here is, that there are some problems with parliaments. I think they're intrinsic. We contain them in the United States. Thank goodness we contain them to our legislatures, while our executives are elected and they each have power to check one another, so nobody gets the ability to become a dictator. And of course, they are all bound by their constitutions, which are then checked by the Supreme Courts of those jurisdictions, state or federal, to make sure that they stay within it. So there's some other third branch of government that's there to make sure that the Constitution is upheld and that the supreme law of the land is a document that everybody agrees to before they ever become somebody in the government. It's prior to their claim of authority for being in the government. They all swear an oath to uphold and keep the Constitution, and then the courts are there to keep them to that. And this, in my opinion, is a superior system. So Hitler saw the problems of a parliament, and he decided that he needed a dictatorship. And the United States shows us that there's a different way. So a lot of the kind of subtext of the Nazi Experiment podcast series has been that the namesake is that they did the Nazi experiment in reaction to a lot of problems. And here in the United States, we have the American experiment. And it's older, but I think it's vastly better. And I think it's something worth continuing. I don't think the American experiment has to end because the woke movement came. And what we're facing with, faced with, and I think you've heard in this episode again, as with many of these, is that the same themes are happening. Oh, we can't solve this by legal means. We can't solve this with the parliament or the legislature with laws. We can't vote our way out of this. Our laws are too corrupted. Our Constitution is already bad. We can't let women vote, whatever it happens to be. And these are mistakes. These are the kinds of mistakes that lead people to desire a cheap, easy answer that is actually a bad one. And that's, I think, what the Nazi experiment offered, a cheap and easy answer to the problems that the German people faced through the 1920s following World War I. And the result was World War II. The result was that they put a genocidal dictator in power with imperial ambitions, and it sparked off a Second World War, 100 million dead in war, God knows what the cost, and like I said, the Holocaust, because the ambitions of that were to purge a scapegoated racial group that was assigned as the source of the weaknesses and problems. The exploiters of the weakness of Parliament, as he said, were Jews. So, of course, you have to destroy the contaminating element, not just the weak system, but the contaminating element that took advantage of it. And it didn't work. The American experiment is a vastly superior experiment. So if you're out there listening, I know I end all of these by saying never again is now, but it's more important, I think, to end this one. It is never again is now. We have these same things happening. But I think it's more interesting and important to end this one differently by saying that now is the time to renew our faith in the American experiment. Now is the time to go and learn what the American experiment is about, why it's different, why it's better, why it's special, why it is designed to be able to absorb and solve these same problems without having to resort to the errors of the Nazis. So, God bless America, I suppose, is the way to end this one.